Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you, especially to be associated with the O'Neill Center, which does such fantastic work. So thank you very much. I teach in a business school at Wake Forest University. My training is actually in philosophy, believe it or not. My PhD is in philosophy from the University of Chicago. So what's a philosopher doing in a business school? Well, there aren't many of us, but there should be more. So if the dean is still here, you're hiring. What I want to talk to you about is following on the themes that Bob mentioned, markets, justice, and have you heard this term called social justice? So a lot of the people who are suspicious of capitalism in one way or another are suspicious on grounds that they will call social justice. Now, I'm actually writing a little bit about this topic, social justice. Turns out it's very hard to figure out what the definition of that term is. It seems to me, it means different things to different people. But one of the things it seems to mean is if there's something I want, I'm going to call it a matter of justice if I don't get it. That doesn't seem like a very good conception of justice, but when you're dealing with students, you got to meet them where they are. And as you probably know, this won't surprise you, I sometimes say that students who come to colleges and universities when they arrive, they have what I call the milk comes from the grocery store theory of economics. So they don't really know anything about production. They don't know anything about where wealth comes from. They don't really have any idea what money is or what prices do. So this, you have to start there. And that's a little bit, I'd like to show you a little bit about what we're doing. So this is just a list of books that have come out recently that are suspicious of capitalism. You can just take a look at some of the titles of these books. Why Not Socialism? Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. Richard Thaler, I would note, just won the Nobel Prize in economics. That book advocates something they call libertarian paternalism, which is they want the government to help structure your choices in such a way that you'll end up making the choice that they knew you should have made. Peter Ubel is a medical doctor at Duke University, just down the road from where I am now. He doesn't leave much doubt about what the substance of the book is. Free Market Madness, how human nature is at odds with economics, why it matters. And there you see Deborah Satz, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, Michael Sandel, What Money Can't Buy, Robert and Edward Skidelsky, that's a father and son, How Much is Enough, Sarah Conley, Against Autonomy. So she doesn't just want nudging. Sarah Conley's a philosopher who wants to remove autonomy altogether. So this is a little bit of the background. Well, with that background, here's a way we might start. Is there anything good about markets? There is this. So what I'm showing you there is worldwide purchasing power parity. This is worldwide GDP. Divided by the number of people in the given year. So you see this is going back. Can you tell how many years that is going back? That's 12,000 years ago. And you will note that for almost all of human history, you have a pretty consistent and consistently low, miserable life until something happened. Now, if you're a social scientist, you don't have to be a social scientist, just a curious person. If you're looking at a graph like that, what part of that graph is the part that needs some explanation? Well, the one that changed. If for the last 12,000 years everybody was relatively equally miserably poor, and then all of a sudden something happened, we want to know what happened, don't we? Well, do you have a theory about that? Let me just give you a little more context just to give you some idea. So Thomas Hobbes, a great English political philosopher, said in 1651, it's a famous quote, "The life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Well, in 1651, that was pretty much true. And in fact, that was true for most people in most of the world up until about 1800. And you can see Gregory Clark, another economic historian, has argued that the average person alive in 1800 was no better off than the average human being alive in 100,000 BC. So there was effectively no change for all of that time. It wasn't as if we were all just waiting for the next iPhone to come out. That's new. Worldwide purchasing power parity per capita varied between $1 and $3 contemporary dollars per day. So just think for a second. Could you live on $3 a day? Only $3 for everything. Now that's for food, shelter, clothing, education, air conditioning in this fine building. That's not a lot of money. But that's what was the case, was the norm for almost all of human history. Today it's $43 in contemporary dollars and constant dollars. In the United States, $153. So this has been an enormous increase. And in fact, one of the greatest achievements of humankind, although it's one of the stories that almost nobody seems to know. So we now live in an age that is wealthier, healthier, happier, freer than any other time in human history, and yet everybody's miserable about it and nobody knows anything about it. So this is something that's important to point out. This is a 16-fold real increase, and in fact, you may know the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey. Deirdre McCloskey has recently estimated that the average person alive today is some 100 times wealthier than the average person alive in 1800 when you include things like what's sometimes called hidden wealth. Like infrastructure and also the internet. So we're going to have a speaker in a little bit, Michael Cox, who has done this great experiment of asking students, how much would we have to pay you to never go on the internet again the rest of your life? I hope I'm not stealing your thunder. So imagine a student today thinking, oh, are you serious? Never go on the internet? So they say things like, $100 million, $1 billion you'd have to pay me never to go on the internet again the rest of your life. Well, then the next question is the interesting one. Ask those same students, well, how much are you yourself actually paying to get on the internet right now? What do you think the answer is? Nothing. They don't pay for the internet. The internet is provided for them by other people, by their parents, by their school, by Starbucks. So something that they themselves value at $100 million or more, they pay nothing for. So that gives you some idea of the power of markets, but it also gives you some idea of just how wealthier we are today than any generation has ever been. So that's a little bit of some context, but let me ask you this question, and this I often get asked: is money the only thing that matters? I've been talking about money and wealth. Is that the only thing that matters? Some of you are not too sure about that. Well, so my answer is no, money is not the only thing that matters. But here's what I would argue. What wealth does do is enable other things that do matter. So if I'm worrying right now about whether my children can eat today or whether they'll be able to eat tomorrow, what I'm not thinking about is what is justice. I'm not thinking about, am I going to be able to send my children to college one day, because I'm worrying about, can they eat? So what wealth can do is enable us to address the more immediate and pressing concerns of human life, so that we can then begin to turn our attention to all of the things that go into making a life of meaning and purpose. So wealth isn't equal to a life of meaning and purpose, but it enables it. And those benefits go beyond just the material. So what are some arguments that people might make on behalf of markets? I thought I would just give you a couple of arguments. I wrote my dissertation on Adam Smith's moral theory. Have you heard of Adam Smith? Has anybody heard of? Wrote my dissertation on Adam Smith's moral theory. So I spent a lot of time looking at the 18th century thinkers, especially in Scotland, who were beginning to make the first cases for markets and commercial society. But these were moral philosophers making these arguments. So what are some of the things? I'll just mention a couple of the claims they made on behalf of commercial society. So the great philosopher, Scottish philosopher from the 18th century, David Hume, there he is. He made these arguments. He said, first of all, luxury is not necessarily a vice. Now that's an important point that might slip your attention today. In the 18th century, there are many people who thought that people who were poor, so the wealthy thought that the people who were poor were probably exactly where they should be. We don't want to give poor people any more money, because if we give them more money, they're just going to spend it in wine, women, and song. They're going to get drunk, and they're going to gamble it away. They're going to indulge in vices. Luxury is a vice. So if you have any time left over from working at the end of the day, you're just going to do bad things, so better that you don't have any time. That was an argument that was made in the 18th century, was made in the 19th century, even into the 20th century. So Hume comes along and says, luxury is not necessarily a vice, and here's why. If you would like to have things that are considered luxury, it leads, as he says, to industry. You start working hard. And if you're working hard to get the things that you think would make your life better, you learn new things. You learn new skills. You learn new abilities. We expand the mechanical arts. We work on engineering and other things, so knowledge increases. And note that third in the second bullet point, industry, knowledge, and humanity. As you work harder, you're not working all by yourself. You're working with other people. And as you work with other people, and as the networks of your cooperation begin to expand, you work with different kinds of people. Sometimes you work with people who have a different religion. Sometimes they come from a different country or speak a different language. Well, before you cooperated with them, working with them, you might have hated them and been willing to kill them. But now you think, well, maybe I can make some money off of them. That's a much better way to deal with people. So it begins to lower the animosities people have towards others. So Hume looks historically and he says, industry, knowledge, and humanity are linked together by an indissoluble chain and are found from experience as well as reason to be peculiar to the more polished and what are commonly denominated the more luxurious ages. So there's the argument. The desire for luxury leads to industry, leads to knowledge, cooperation, and social polish, or what David Hume calls humanity. Just a couple more, because in today's day, these are particularly apt. Nothing new under the sun. Markets increasingly serve to the ornament and pleasure of life. We should not disdain the small ornaments of life that enable it to be a little bit more pleasurable, according to Hume. So maybe adding one extra little marginal unit for someone and allowing somebody to buy a pin or a button or a pen or a ribbon, something that might not be available when you're extremely poor. But those little things actually begin to fill out a life that a person can actually enjoy. So a life that's not just mere drudgery, but a life that is part of and a reflection of your identity. So he says this, as people become more prosperous, they can actually become happier. Now, we have a lot of data about this now. He didn't have this in the 18th century, but it seems like he might have been onto something. He says it also generates, so I teach at Wake Forest. You may know Wake Forest is in North Carolina, and a hurricane has just hit North Carolina. Well, to rebuild, that's going to take a lot of resources, doesn't it? Where do those resources come from? Well, one of the things that Hume mentioned was that as a nation becomes more prosperous, it builds up, as he calls, a kind of storehouse of labor or a storehouse of wealth that can be drawn on in exactly such exigencies. So exactly when you need it most, you have something. If everybody's living at the level of subsistence, a hurricane just kills everybody. But if we have resources that we've been able to build, then in those kinds of cases, we can actually dedicate them to saving and rebuilding. One more from Hume. I couldn't resist this given the trade policy discussions we're having in the United States today. Hume said, now this is in the 18th century, he says, they consume, other people, they consume the produce of my industry and afford me the pleasure of theirs in return. I shall therefore venture to acknowledge that not only as a man, but as a British subject, I pray for the flourishing commerce of Germany, Spain, and even France. You just got to love that, even France itself. Did the British like the French in the 18th century? Not so much. And so the idea that it would be okay if France flourished too, that wouldn't be bad for us, that might actually be good for us, because trade is what we might call positive sum. People only trade with each other when they both benefit. Now that's a counterintuitive claim. Try telling that to your average college student who hasn't had an economics class and try to explain that to them. It's a bit counterintuitive, and you have to tell them about 100 or 200 times to get them to see that. But Hume was already onto it. So here's his argument. Commerce and markets lead to industry, knowledge, and humanity. They lead to personal, national, and even international prosperity. And they lead to decreasing animosity. Other people, we see them not as enemies, but as potential opportunities. Now, here's my suggestion to you, ladies and gentlemen. Those are moral goals. Those are good things, aren't they? Those aren't bad things. Okay, now I can't not say something about Adam Smith, so I will mention one thing about Adam Smith. Perhaps you've heard this phrase, or perhaps you've seen this passage. It's the most passage in all of economics, not just in Adam Smith. By directing his industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Now, there's been a lot of scholarly ink spilled about that two-word phrase. It's almost like the due process clause in the Constitution. People make their whole careers writing about just those two words. And for full disclosure, I've written about it too, so I won't, thank goodness there are still markets a little bit in academia. So what's Smith mean by that? Here's what he means. People naturally seek to better their own conditions. He doesn't think this is anything you need to tell people to do. They will do this on their own. Whatever situation you are in, you will seek to improve it, and you'll seek to improve it by your own lights. So in other words, whatever you think would be an improvement of your situation, you're going to look for ways to do that. Now here's the sort of political economy point. In what Smith calls a well-governed society, that is only possible if you simultaneously benefit other people. That's the key. So let me give you an example. So I notice Professor Lawson over there has a very nice iPhone. Suppose I'd like to have that iPhone. There are two ways I could get that from him, aren't there? What's one way I could get that from him? Oh, I love that that's the first thing people thought of. So I could, yeah, I guess I could kill him, I could steal it, I could defraud him, I could tell him I'll pay him $10,000 in 2 weeks, and then he gives me the phone and I just leave. I could do all of those things. What's another way I might be able to get that from him? I could make him an offer that he is freely able to accept or not, and if we agree, then we voluntarily exchange. Now, which of those two, ladies and gentlemen, is more moral? In a well-governed society, what Smith means is that we have a protection of what he calls justice. So now my topic was justice and social justice. What Adam Smith means is a society that is well-governed protects justice of person, property, and promise. In other words, no one may kill or assault or enslave you. That's person. Whatever is yours, no one may take from you or trespass on without your permission. And if you've made a voluntary promise or you've written a contract, express or even sometimes implicit, you have to keep it. If we have governmental public institutions that protect those things, then what else do you need in order to enable prosperity? Smith's answer is not much, because of the first thing up there. People will all on their own strive to better their conditions, and they'll do so in cooperation with others. So see the last bullet point there. What this encourages people to do is to engage in cooperation and not what we might call extraction. Extraction is theft, coercion, enslavement, etc. So a well-governed society protects that conception. It's called a negative, Smith calls it a negative conception of justice, because it really just asks you to refrain from injuring other people. If you just don't attack, steal, etc., other people, make promises you don't want to keep, if you don't do any of those things, then you're already acting with you're respecting the person, property, and promise of others. And in conditions like that, people will all on their own begin to look for ways that will benefit themselves in cooperation with others, and it will then, as if by an invisible hand, benefit those others as well. So that's Smith's argument. Now, last little point about Smith. He thinks commerce benefits everybody. These transactions are what we call positive sums. So you may have heard this term. If you go into Starbucks and you give you order your double pumpkin spice mocha latte, and you give the barista, I don't know what that would cost, $5, $10, I don't know. You give $5, you get the latte. Which of you benefits from that transaction? It's a trick question. Both of you do. We know that both Starbucks and you must have benefited, because if either one of you thought you didn't benefit, you would have said no thanks and gone somewhere else. But since you both agreed to the transaction, you both benefited. That's why we call it a positive sum. It's not one person benefiting at the expense of another. It's both benefiting from the transaction. So that's what happens in these market transactions. And Smith says this leads to, these are his terms, universal opulence that extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. As wealth begins to increase, who benefits first and most? Smith says it's the least advantaged people in society. Kings, pharaohs, emperors, they've always gotten their own, haven't they? They take care of themselves. Who are the people that markets begin to benefit most? It's the everyday worker. It's the person who now doesn't have to ask permission to improve his or her life, but can do it all on your own. That tends to be the lower classes of wealth. So a general plenty diffuses itself throughout all the different ranks of society, and the most dissimilar geniuses become of use to one another. Different people, instead of our differences being reasons for us to kill one another, they're reasons for us to complement one another. That's a big transition. So when you remember that graph I showed you with the long, low red line and then the sudden increase, that correlates pretty closely with this transition almost in attitudes. People started to think, well, maybe the best way to deal with others isn't to kill them or enslave them. Maybe the best way to deal with them is see if I can make myself better by cooperating with them. This is a fundamental transition in human attitudes and human convention, human culture. And there is some empirical evidence today. I won't give it to you, although I'm happy to afterwards if you're interested. There's empirical evidence today that the more experience human beings in different parts of the world have with markets or commercial exchange, the more trusting they are, the more they believe in norms of fairness, and the more they empathize with other people's positions. I'll come back to that in just a second. Okay. Now a couple of objections. If I still have a couple of minutes, how am I doing? So what about social justice? Maybe you're worried about social justice, or maybe your kids or grandkids or everybody you talk to is worried about social justice. There is a position in political philosophy called luck egalitarianism. I apologize about that ugly word, but that's what it's called. Luck egalitarianism. The view is pretty simple. It says luck plays a pretty big role in everybody's life. We have good luck, we have bad luck. Some people have had more bad luck overall than other people. Some people have had more good luck overall than other people. So maybe you were lucky enough to be born to parents who loved you and you had a loving family. Maybe they sent you to a good school, you lived in a good community. Maybe somebody else didn't have any of those things growing up. So the luck egalitarian says the success you ultimately come to have in life is going to depend at least partly on the luck you've had, good or bad. Maybe not entirely on that. It's also due to things you yourself did. But at least some of it is due to luck. And the luck egalitarian says if some proportion of your relative success in life is due to good luck, good fortune that you yourself didn't have anything to do with, then maybe what we should do is redistribute some of the fruits of your success to people who've had bad luck. We want to equalize the effects of luck in life, hence the term luck egalitarianism. Let's equalize that. That's the position, okay? So that's an objection to markets, and the idea is that markets often reward people who are lucky, and they punish people who are unlucky, okay? I see some of you already skeptical about, maybe you know where I'm going to go. So what I'd like to do is to give you, I'm going to try to offend as many of you as possible with this. I don't believe in safe spaces. Universities should be safe spaces for free speech. That's what it should be. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to take a rather radical position. Let's suppose you've had undeserved bad luck in life. And in addition to that, you've suffered some serious disappointment that we would all agree is reasonable. It's reasonable for you to feel disappointed. What I would like to argue is that those two things together don't mean anybody owes you anything. They don't necessarily mean that anybody owes you anything. Now, there are people who will argue that even if one of those obtains, either undeserved bad luck or reasonable disappointment, if you have either one of those, then somebody should compensate you somehow. I'm going to make even the stronger case. Put them both together. Still doesn't necessarily mean anybody owes you anything. Now, I'm going to give you an example to illustrate this. So Jack and Jill, I want you to think about Jack and Jill, who are two students at Wake Forest University. Names have been changed to protect the innocent. They were graduating seniors. They were both economics majors, and they'd been dating for some time, and they were beginning to think about whether they should start coordinating plans after they graduated. This was March of their senior year. Jill, for her part, has been beginning to think that maybe Jack is the one for her, and Jack is starting to think maybe Jill is the one for him, and so they haven't talked about the M word, but they're starting to have these thoughts. On a Sunday evening, Jack calls Jill and says, Jill, I'd like to take you out to dinner next Saturday night. And she says, great. And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, it's going to be special? And he says, it's going to be special. And she says, okay. So she hangs up the phone and she says to her roommates, Jack just asked me to dinner next Saturday night. He says it's going to be special. You don't think he's going to ask me to marry him, do you? And they say, he is totally going to ask you to marry him. So she starts thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do if he asks me to marry? So she starts imagining things. She starts imagining what her life might be if she married Jack. She writes her name on things, Mrs. Jack, to see how it feels. She decides that if he asks me to marry him, I'm going to say yes. Okay? Next day, Monday, so later after Jack gets off the phone, he calls a restaurant and he says, I'd like to make a reservation for 2 for dinner next Saturday night. I'm going to ask my girlfriend to marry me. And they say, oh, great, wonderful, we'll make it special for you. And he says, thank you. On the next day, Monday, Jack goes to a jewelry store, and he goes in with his student loan money. No, don't do that. That's not allowed. But he buys an engagement ring. And about the same time that Jack is buying the engagement ring, Jill is in one of her classes, and she's not really paying very much attention because she's thinking about what might be coming. And after the class is over, she's on her way out, and she gets stopped by Joe. Now, who's Joe? Well, Joe had been in the class the whole semester, and she hadn't really noticed him. They hadn't really been friends. But Joe said to her, hey, Jill, I missed what the professor said at the end of class. Did you happen to get that in your notes? And she said, oh, yeah, sure, let me check. And she looks at her notes, and she looks at Joe, and there's a spark. So they chat for a little bit, and Joe says, hey, you want to go get a cup of coffee? And she says, sure, I had a class, but I don't need to go to class. Sure. So they go and get a cup of coffee. And they talk for a while. They end up talking for hours. They miss all the rest of their classes the rest of that day. Joe looks at his watch and he says, oh my gosh, I can't believe how late it's been. It's been so great talking with you. Would you like to go get a bite to eat? And she says, oh, sure. I guess I missed my final exam review session, but that's fine. And I was supposed to visit my grandma in the hospital. She's in intensive care. I'm sure she'll be fine. Yeah, let's go get a bite to eat. So they go get a bite to eat. They talk even more. They walk the quad. They go to the library. They walk and talk all night long. It's now the next morning. They're sitting on the quad at Wake Forest. The sun's coming up over Waite Chapel. Joe looks at the sun. He looks at Jill. He says, I've never met anybody like you before. I can't believe the feelings I'm having. Jill, marry me right now. Let's elope. Let's go to Las Vegas right now. And all of a sudden, she sort of snaps out of her reverie that she'd been in. She looks at her phone. She hadn't looked at her phone, and she looks at it. She's got 78 texts from Jack and her friends. What happened to you? Where are you? Are you dead? She'd been ignoring all of these things. Her mind starts swirling, and she looks at Joe, and she says, yes. Okay? She goes to Las Vegas and elopes with Joe. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to ask you, I want you to think about that scenario. And now I want to ask you to remember, do you remember poor old Jack? Remember him? Did Jack have some undeserved bad luck? Was it bad luck that the longtime girlfriend he was about to ask to marry him met some guy the week he was going to ask her and decided to elope? That seems like bad luck. If Jack is pretty disappointed by it, is it reasonable that he's disappointed by it? Yeah, it seems like it. So here's the question, what is he owed? So should he be able to sue Jill for the future affection he intended to get from her and now won't be able to? Should he be able to sue her for the 9 children he wanted her to bear him and now he won't have? No. What about society? Does society have some obligation? Should we pass a law that says people like Joe should never talk to people like Jill? No. Now, the answer to all of those questions is no, and the reason for that is that Jack had no right to Jill. He had no right to Jill. Jill is a free person. She gets to decide what she wants to do, and if she decides to give her affection to one person or withhold her affection from another person, that is her right, even if it's bad luck for the other guy, and even if it's really disappointing for the other guy. So it may well be. So is it lamentable? Yeah, it's a bummer. Does it warrant help? Well, if you're a buddy of Jack's, maybe you take him out for a beer and say, dude, that's a bummer. That's fine. Maybe you introduce him to somebody else. You introduce him to Jenny. I don't know, maybe Jerry. It's the 21st century. Can you do any of those things? Sure. But what you can't do is visit a harm or a cost on Jill because he had no right to Jill in the first place. So I would say it's no injustice that requires compensation. Now, how does that relate to markets? Same thing for what goes on in commercial societies. If you've always been going to coffee shop A and the owner has come to count on you going to that coffee shop, and then one day coffee shop B opens up across the street and you discover you like coffee shop B better, and you stop going to coffee shop A and you go to only coffee shop B, and maybe lots of people decide they like coffee shop B better and they go to coffee shop B, and what happens to coffee shop A? Maybe it goes out of business. Is that bad luck for the owner of coffee shop A? Yes. Is the disappointment the owner no doubt feels reasonable? Yes. Is there anything that we should do about it? My argument is no, because the owner of coffee shop A had no more right to the patrons or their resources than Jack had to Jill, in exactly the same way. Okay, I want to give you one more thought experiment before we finish. So another part of social justice, or as I said, social justice is defined by people in different ways, but one central aspect of it is a worry about inequality. Do you think justice should address material inequality? Is that a matter of justice? Let me give you a thought experiment here. Suppose you have 2 people, A and B. I'm not going to tell you who these 2 people are, but one of them, A, has a lot more money than B. Let's say A has 10 times as much wealth as B. Let's raise the stakes. Let's make it 100 times. A has 100 times more wealth than B. Now, if I tell you nothing else about them, would you think that a society must be unjust in which it's possible for one person to have 100 times more wealth than another person? Now, you can think about that on your own, but that's a question that a lot of people answer in the affirmative. They'll say, yeah, there's got to be something wrong with the society that could allow that kind of inequality. So they may say it's a failure of justice, or maybe a failure of social justice, if you like. Well, while you're thinking about that, let me tell you who my A and B are. Here's my A. You recognize him? Who's that? That's Bill Gates. Bill Gates is, I checked this morning, he's worth about $90 billion. It goes up and down with the market returns, but what's a billion among friends? It's about $90 billion. Who is the poor person who must soldier on with only 1/100th as much wealth as Bill Gates? Well, I might have picked, there are lots of people I might have picked, but there's one. You recognize him? That's Michael Jordan. So Michael Jordan is worth only $900 million, the poor soul. Now, this is obviously an extreme comparison, but what's the point I'd like to make? What I would like to suggest is that what matters is not the distance between what Bill Gates has and what Michael Jordan has. What matters is these two questions. First of all, how did they get it? Did they get it through force or fraud or theft? In other words, did they get it through extraction, or did they get it through voluntary cooperation? That makes a really big difference in how we evaluate what people have. And also, I think we have to pay attention to the absolute quality of life. Yes, it's true that Michael Jordan has only 1/100th as much as Bill Gates. And by the way, Bill Gates, you may remember, he doesn't do this anymore, but years ago he used to go around saying publicly, you know, I could buy and sell Michael Jordan 100 times over. You know, this is sort of his nerds and geeks are better than athletes and jocks. He doesn't say that anymore, but he used to say that. So it may be true that Bill Gates has 100 times as much as Michael Jordan, but Michael Jordan is probably doing just fine by any absolute standard. So what matters, I think, is not just whether there's someone who has more than you, but what is the actual condition of your position. I think the absolute condition matters more. But maybe you're a little skeptical. Maybe you think, okay, 100 times is not enough. Let's raise the differential. Let's say it's 1,000 times. Let's raise it by another order of magnitude, 100,000 times. Let's make it even more. Let's say, who is the person who has only 1/180,000th of Bill Gates' wealth? Now that's a tiny fraction of Bill Gates' wealth. Are there people like that? So this is someone you might think must really be a miserable, poor schmuck. Who is that person? That's me. Actually, I rounded up a little bit, but it's good enough for government work. So here's the more philosophical question I would ask you. Let's suppose it's the case that you had it within your power to change one thing in the world. You could either eliminate poverty in the world, or you could eliminate inequality in the world. Which would you get rid of? Okay. So some of you are already telling me your answers. I don't want to be coy. I'll tell you what my answer is. My answer is poverty. If you had to choose one or the other, I would answer poverty. Poverty is the source of far greater misery than inequality is. Now, is it the case that we have to address that we can't do both of those at the same time? So empirical evidence suggests the answer is yes. It looks like that might be the actual dilemma we face. So the institutions we've been able to figure out that finally began to lift human beings out of the historical poverty they had been in also enabled inequality. On the other hand, it is possible to minimize inequality, so make people more equal, but when you do that, as the rest of that graph shows, they are equally what? Poor. Now, there is some evidence that suggests that there's something of a curve there. So initially, as countries begin to generate wealth, you get a lot of inequality, and then the inequality begins to taper off. But nevertheless, there will still be great inequality, as the case in the United States with Bill Gates and Jim Otteson show. Okay. Is there such a thing as capitalist equality? So capitalism allows for material inequality. But there is a different sense of equality that I would like to suggest to you that was already back in Adam Smith. This is the second most famous passage from Adam Smith after the invisible hand passage. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and we never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. The famous butcher, brewer, baker passage. Now, when you hear that, is this what you hear? Do you hear selfishness? You hear Adam Smith saying, maybe encouraging selfishness, or maybe just describing human beings as being naturally selfish. That's what Karl Marx thought, by the way. So have you heard of Karl Marx? Karl Marx came in the next century. Adam Smith was in the 18th. Karl Marx came in the 19th century. Marx read The Wealth of Nations. He read this and said, well, there it is. It's the smoking gun right there, not even 20 pages into the 1,000-page long Wealth of Nations. Smith is saying capitalism is all about selfishness. Well, maybe that is what at the end of the day, how you would interpret Smith. I would like to give you one other way to think about this. And this is what I think Smith's own view is. It's not about selfishness, but rather about respect. So think about that positive sum, mutually voluntary, beneficial transaction we were talking about before. If you want to succeed in a commercial society, you want to succeed in markets, who do you have to spend your time thinking about? I mean, maybe some of you are business people, maybe you are entrepreneurs, maybe you run or own companies. What's keeping you up at night? I mean, I probably don't need to tell you. I do need to tell students this because they have no idea. If you're spending your time in a commercial society trying to run a business by thinking only about you, what's in it for me, and I'm number one, you will go out of business in a New York minute. What do you have to do? You have to spend all of your time thinking about everybody else. You're thinking about your employees, your customers, your clients, all of the people you rely on. You have to be thinking about them all the time. Because what can a potential employee, customer, or client do if they don't like what you're offering them? They say no thanks and go somewhere else. And so if you say, well, I demand this because I think this is what I want, people will say that's nice and go somewhere else, and you will go out of business. So what that means is that everybody has what I call an opt-out option. So the butcher, brewer, and the baker, you go into, this is Adam Smith's example, but if you go into the butcher and you make an offer, the butcher has a price, you can always say no thank you and go somewhere else. Because of that opt-out option, that means that you must pay attention to the other person. I have to think not just about what I want, but what I have that could benefit you from your perspective. What you think would benefit you. That means I have to pay attention to you. So from Adam Smith's perspective, what that encourages is a kind of mutual respect. It means if you say no thanks, I can't just kill you, I can't steal from you, I have to respect that option. And so if we want to work together, we have to respect one another and pay attention to each other's interests. So what I would suggest is that that implies a kind of equality of what I call moral agency. It means everybody who meets each other, you meet each other as peers. If everybody has the opt-out option, Bill Gates comes to me and says, I want you to work for me, and he offers me a lot of money. He could offer me a lot more money than I'm making now, I'm sure. But no matter how much it is, if I don't want to do the job, what can I always say? No thanks, and go somewhere else. And as long as I can say no thanks and he can't force me, however much wealth he has, we are suddenly equals. We are moral equals. Nobody can force anybody else. And I give you that somewhat silly picture. Fleming Jenkins was a philosopher of science in the 19th century, famous one. This was his picture of the market. He drew this on a piece of paper. He says, this is what a market is like. You notice no one person is more important than the other, and they're all sort of linked. I don't know, I think that's the idea that's supposed to. Okay, so let's conclude. I asked at the beginning, is there anything good we can say about markets? So there are some benefits to markets. Here are some of them. They lead to increasing overall prosperity. That's a good thing. Not just because of the wealth itself, but also because of the other things it enables. It can lead to a softening of antagonisms among people, or what David Hume called humanity, because you want to cooperate with people, not kill them. And remember, it wasn't too long ago in human history when one of the main ways that you got whatever you wanted was by killing the person who had it. I mean, we tend to forget just how violent human history has been, but rates of violence have gone down precipitously in the last couple of centuries, perhaps not coincidentally correlating with the rise of commercial societies and markets. And it can, because of the opt-out option and the requirement for mutual respect, it can actually encourage proper relations among individuals based on this mutual respect. Those are pretty good things. So that's just a summary. You get increasing wealth, decreasing violence, increasing knowledge and virtue. Now, does that mean it's going to be perfect? Well, ladies and gentlemen, the answer to that is no. There is no set of human institutions that will be perfect, and that's not because we can't conceive of a system that might be perfect. It's because human beings aren't perfect. Human beings are flawed creatures, and you're not going to get rid of the flaws. So this entire project from Adam Smith and David Hume, their conception of commercial society and what we might now call liberalism, a sort of classical liberalism, did not aim at perfecting us or having a perfect system. What it aimed at was real and continual improvement. So we might not ever get a perfect society, but it will continue to get better, both economically and morally. So here are my conclusions. Markets lead to increasing prosperity. Commerce and trade encourage better relations among people, and I asked you this before, which is better, extraction or cooperation? That's a pretty fundamental thing, isn't it? Now, are there places in the world today where extraction is still going on? Yeah, there are. Are there some ways in even the United States in which extraction is going on? Yes, there is, yes. So what's the claim that's being made here? To the extent possible, cooperation is always to be preferred over extraction. And I will say, and this is just me editorializing for a second, but I tell my students this, if you're thinking about doing something where you're going to have to make somebody else do something they don't want to do, that's a red flag. Maybe you should really rethink whatever it is you're doing. It's a little bit like, if you're about to do something and you think you're going to have to make up for it afterwards, that's a red flag too. Not just when you're a college student, but kind of in life. Those are red flags. Similarly with extraction and cooperation. If you're proposing to make people do things that they don't want to do, that has to meet a pretty high burden of justification, because other people are people too, and they have rights, not just you. So what might we get from commercial society, prosperity and morality? And perhaps, I'll leave you with this, maybe that is true social justice. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We have great timing. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes for questions. We're going to have microphones. This is being recorded, so if you have a question, I'll let Jim handle the, picking out who to answer. But if you have a question, please use a microphone. We have them on both aisles.
Fourth row up here on the left, yes.
Thank you very, very much. Informative. At the beginning, you had that graph.
Yes.
And it looked to me like somewhere around 2000 or just the year maybe past that.
Yeah.
What could you talk to us about?
I can get it.
Your feelings about what was going on, that all of a sudden the per capita just went crazy?
Yeah, so you can't quite, because the years are so compressed there, you can't quite get the granularity that you might otherwise like. The upticks began, you can begin to see them already in the late 16th, early 17th century, begins to pick up steam, no pun intended, in the 18th and the 19th centuries, and then really takes off in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I will say that there are Nobel Prize winners with various theories about what, so we don't disagree about what happened, but there is disagreement about why what happened. There's quite a bit of disagreement about that. So I'll just say, in the interest of time, I'll give you just a thumbnail of what my own view is. I think people began to, there was really a kind of change in culture and change in attitude. People began to think for the first time that maybe slavery wasn't the best way to get what you want. And they didn't do it on efficiency grounds. They weren't making efficiency calculations. For some reason, and maybe you have a theory, I have a theory, but for some reason people began to think that enslaving people was a morally bad thing to do. And when people began to change their moral view about it, other things began to change too. So it wasn't just slavery, but it was also, how do we deal with strangers? One way to deal with strangers is by killing them. One way to deal with strangers is by taking all of their stuff from them. But as people began to change their minds about whether that was morally acceptable or not, they began to associate differently with one another, which led to differences, changes in institutions. And as the institutions and the attitudes began to change, you had a kind of multiplier effect. It's like the miracle of compounding interest. As soon as that began to take off and began to spread, these attitudes about strangers are opportunities, not enemies, that really just led to an explosion of wealth unlike anything we'd had before. Good question. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Early on, you talked about the meltdown. And you cannot talk about, I believe, capitalism and ethics without bringing in the role of the federal government and the rules and regulations. What I believe as a capitalist is that the government only has two roles to play: to ensure a fair and open marketplace and to ensure that no company gets too big to fail. Your comments, please.
Sounds like you have a little bit invested in my answer that I'm going to give you here. So I'm gonna do what I've been trained to do as a philosophy professor and dodge the question. I'm kidding. So Professor Lawson, right at the beginning when he made his introduction, gave you a couple of statistics about increasing popularity of socialism among people. So I had mentioned, students when they come in, by the way, freshmen now, they were born in 2000. They have no memory of 9/11, so that's not part of their living experience. And so 9/11 is like the fall of the Berlin Wall, is like World War II. It's in the mists of history. If you ask them when those things happened, they have no idea. They can Google it. They'll find out very quickly, but they don't keep any of those facts in their brain. But one thing that they do remember is the economic downturn of 08-09. That they remember. And here's the story they think they remember. They were mostly in middle school then, but what they think they remember from that is that capitalism went crazy, as it's liable to do. And we were only saved from the brink of ruin by wise and decisive leadership but from the federal government that reined in the excesses of capitalism. So, one of the sort of sociological claims I would make about why young people, including millennials, tend to be more sympathetic to socialism, it's not just because they don't know any of these facts that we've talked about. It's not just because they don't know anything about economics. It's also because that's a very powerful narrative for them. Capitalism left to its own devices destroys things. They think of it like some kind of spreading disease that will just consume everything. It's like the locusts or something. And the only way you can prevent the locusts from eating all the crops is if some wise people, the wise omniscient farmer or whoever it is, comes in and saves it. That's a powerful narrative. And as incomplete as that might be, that's, I think, exactly the reason why we need to be thinking about these kinds of things. So when you say, I think the government should only serve these two purposes, what I would say is I think we need to back up before we ever get to that. We've got to figure out where can we start, because if we start with that, then people will just say, well, I think it should do these 700 things. And okay, we just have to agree to disagree. But if we can start with a point like what we want is a flourishing, prosperous, free society, right? Right. Okay. Now the question is, how do we get there? And that might enable us to have a conversation that more than one person people from different perspectives might actually agree on. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's saying maybe we could start a little bit earlier before we start making the actual policy prescriptions we have. Back in the back there. Yes, sir.
Loved the lecture.
Oh, thank you.
I wish you could teach my kids high school. What I always run up against with adults is, well, isn't there a bare minimum in a wealthy country like this that everybody should have? Health care, education, a house. Next thing you know, there's this bare minimum living standard that they assume everybody is entitled to, and if they don't have it, it's injustice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, talking about being entitled to things is a dangerous slope to go down. But I think if you're asking me about maybe a strategic or rhetorical way to have a conversation with people who make this kind of argument, what I would say is you might just concede it and say, yeah, common decency in the United States in 2018. Common decency is that everybody should have, whatever the list is, at a minimum. But then the next question is, well, what's the best way to get that? I mean, suppose you'd like everybody to have all the health care they need. Well, we can't all have all the health care we want because we don't have unlimited resources. Because the resources are limited, they're growing, but they're limited. So you have to make choices about where they go, where they should go first, where they should go second, where they should go third. Now, that's not me being mean. That's living in the fallen condition of humanity. Until we have until we have infinite resources, we have to make choices. And by the way, you can think about this with time. So one way I make this claim is with my students is about time. How much time do you? What's one of your most precious resources? It's time. Why is time so precious? It's absolutely limited. It started at one point, and I'm sorry to say it will end at one point, and you can't manufacture more time. That's all you have. And any amount of time you spend doing one thing is time that is lost to all the other things you might have done forever. It's gone for the entire history of the universe. Resources are scarce. So because of that, that forces us to make choices. We can't do all the things we would like to do. We have to decide what's the most important, the second most important, third most important, and so on. All of that is beginning to point to, well, the larger question of how do we make that kind of decision. So we can say that, yes, people should have, and give a list of things people should have. But if the next question is, suppose we can't get everybody all of those things, how do we prioritize? Now, one way to begin to be thinking about prioritizing is to allow markets, because that's effectively what they do. What happens in markets is resources tend to get allocated to places where they're most needed. So right now, as we speak, there are a lot of resources going to North Carolina. Construction resource, carpenters, electricians, they're all racing to North Carolina. Well, one thing that markets can help do is send signals, via prices usually, but they send signals to people about where resources are most needed. So that's beginning to become a lecture I'm giving you. I don't want to give you a lecture, but all that's to say is that saying we really want to have X, whatever X is not yet enough for a proposal of political economy. The next question is, how do we get X, and what do we have to give up in order to get it? Once you start having those kinds of questions, well, then we're having an adult conversation. Before that, it's just grandstanding. Yeah.
We have time for one more quick question.
Pick for me. I don't want to be the person who picks the last question. Okay.
Thank you.
Apologies to everybody else.
Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah, thank you for your lecture. I'm from China, so I know all about so-called equality. Most part of my life, we had absolute equality in so-called material things.
Yes.
And one example is after I graduated from college, everybody graduated from college that year get exactly the same wage, salary. Was 59.25 yen, which is about $8 a month. Everybody, regardless your major, your school, your job, everybody had the same. What we didn't have equality was what you mentioned, very important. We didn't have equal moral equality. We didn't have equal opportunities. And they didn't think about that. They only look at materials.
Yeah.
We had the medical care, housing, food, salary, everything. So that's why it's scary when the people talk about equal opportunity, equal, education and food and housing and things. That's really scary. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that comment. I guess what I would say is, maybe by way of closing, one of the things that is maybe surprising, but also a little disappointing to me anyway, when you hear arguments made by people who who call themselves socialists, so not people you call them just to insult them, but people who call themselves socialists, they tend to focus, the arguments tend to focus to a surprising degree on just the material aspects of life. So it's just about money. As if that's really the only thing that matters. Do I have more money than you? Do you have more money than me? And that's the only thing that matters. I think your comment, what that brings out, is that there's a lot more to life than just that. And I think what markets and commercial society can do is enable people to use the tool of wealth. But remember that it's a tool. It's not the end of life. It's what enables other things in life. So if the only thing you're allowed to think about is money, that's in a moral way an impoverished life. Not just materially impoverished, but morally, your soul is impoverished. But if you have the opportunity to construct for yourself a life of meaning and purpose according to what you think is a life of meaning and purpose, that's real wealth, I would say. That's real riches, no matter how much money is in the bank account, whether it's a lot or a little. Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.